Really pleased today to introduce Dwayne Oyler and Jenny Wu. These faculty talks, are always an opportunity to see what everyone's doing outside the walls of SCI-Arc. We're of course familiar with both of them and their teaching. It should be noted they were recognized this year by the Architecture League of New York as one of the emerging voices of 2012. A very nice list to be on. As a way maybe to throw some things, because as I understand, Jenny and Dwayne are going to be speaking in three parts, and then with discussions with Todd, which I think is a great way to do this rather than waiting to the end. I just have a few words that I wanted to talk about with their work. Some might say architects are like jewelers, like watchmakers. We zoom into the micro scale to assemble material into larger constructs. Dwayne and Jenny are interested in this. They weave lines of matter like jewelers. It's like they have monocles permanently attached to their eyes, seeing details no one else sees. Serious rigor aimed at an interest in spatial complexity combined with a maniacal focus on the tectonic. If others won't build it, they will do it themselves. Do small ideas scale up to larger problems? In Rem Koolhaas's book, Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large, the thesis of bigness challenged the old architectural principles of composition, scale, proportion, and detail, claiming that they may no longer apply to the very large project. The work of Oyler Wu is beginning to delve into this problem as larger commissions create new opportunities and challenges. Do small ideas scale up? Will details still matter? Is it time to take off the monocles and view it all from above? Dwayne and Jenny are here to tell us. Please welcome Jenny Wu and Dwayne Oyler.
So we wanted to show that video because a lot of you here probably know us from our kind of aluminum work, and We thought that the Ali project, which we did in collaboration with an artist, Michael Kalish, was kind of a provisional end to, let's say, the aluminum material projects. So at that point, which we did last year, I think it was a really good time for us to kind of look back at what we've done so far and how we got to where we are, and then what's next and how we move forward. And I think that one of the things we're not going to do today is actually talk about any project in its entirety, but more pick 3 topics that we're going to use the project as to expand on the topics and explain the ideas.
So we thought we'd start out by going way back to a couple of projects that were our own student projects. On the left, you've got Jenny's thesis, a project where she was interested in the idea of taking lines of movement, different forms of transportation movement, and kind of bundling them into a knot. And one of my own from undergraduate on the right, a project that was really about sort of experiencing this line work and the interplay of light that resulted from it. And on the surface, both of those, in the previous views, you almost understand like a drawing, simple series of lines brought together. But as you got into the project, in both cases, you realized that it was really about a kind of spatial understanding of the lines and the effects that those might have. In Jenny's case, it was about wrapping program with these lines, and in my case, it was about immersing you in the experience of the lines. And there were several principles about this line work that we wanted to talk about that are so important to us. One of them had to do with a buildup of densities in the lines. And why we found that especially interesting, still find it interesting, is first a set of aesthetic principles, that idea that there are sort of flows of material moving through the thing and it keeps the eye moving in a certain way. But also that there was, it allowed you to understand the piece, as the visitor, to really understand it as something where your focus oscillated from something that was in the foreground and in the background. So you might understand a single line as a simple object in front of you, but within a split second, you then refocus and see spatial depth and series of lines in the background. It also has the ability to create a kind of a form of a perceptual enclosure. In other words, you might understand a series of lines as forming a space 1 second, but then, like that principle of the line and the refocusing, instantly that sense of enclosure goes away and you're able to understand multiple layers of depth. We've also had an interest in line as structure throughout most of the projects. And the reason for that is because we're really interested in the idea that the performative aspect of line brings with it an understanding of the work that sort of keeps you asking how it performs and what it does. In other words, as you encounter each of the pieces, we've always liked the idea that at first the thing might be understood as a gestural piece, just about line and just an aesthetic principle. But the moment you start to look to the piece for more, you realize that there is a performative aspect to the work, that it is working, and that it takes time as you're experiencing the piece to understand exactly how it works. Our approach has never been for efficiency. It's never been a pure engineering approach, but it does perform structurally, and we think that enriches the way that you perceive the work.
I mean, one of the kind of the funniest way that an engineer has ever described our structure is that it has the most tortured low path. So,
in a lot of the line work, we've experimented with a lot of different types of shape making. We haven't strictly adhered to bent line or curve, and we've also been interested in the idea that there could be an interplay of different types of other objects in addition to lines. So in a case like this, a small fence for a project in Santa Monica, it was about trying to create some kind of ripple effect or dialogue between the line and the surface beyond. And the use of that line allowed for a greater sense of depth and enclosure, but again, one that was a little bit ambiguous in its definition.
So this was a project, a model actually we did for the Guggenheim Museum a couple years ago. And one of the kind of requirements of the show, and it's called Contemplating the Void, it was to commemorate the ancient space, the rotunda. And one of the requirements of the show was that it had to be a two-dimensional drawing. So we actually compressed a three-dimensional model into a 2-inch, two-dimensional drawing per se. And I think the thing that we couldn't do it in just kind of making it into a graphic, but we were still interested in the kind of the space of the stair that then we weave through the void space.
And that use of line is something that's played out in drawings that we've done for a long time, starting with the sketches on the right, things that we've always seen as having the ability to sort of stretch over very long periods of time one's ability to understand line in space through your ability to draw them. And in the left, a more technical drawing of pendulum plane done after the piece was complete. And in this case, it was really about using line as a graphic, as something that not only could communicate the technical aspects of the project, but through the use of line tried to capture some of the spirit or qualitative aspects of the work.
So we're going to pause here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So this is the tricky part for me. I don't know where you're going to stop, so I have to always be ready to say something clever. Which, we'll see how good I do with that. Where to start? First of all, move over. This is a bad design. That's better. Now I don't have to look through the microphone to see the images. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to get into the work, and I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so, but in any event, I'm going to start with there are two stories that I thought I could tell today, and so and I can't decide which one to tell first. So I guess I'll start with the older one, which was when I first met these two, like 5-6 years ago, at your old studio in the cement building, and they were showing a picture of one of these linear projects, which you didn't show, I don't think, the M&A installation. Okay, so it's coming up, and they had just finished a series of really great projects in wood with incredibly exquisite details, and I got to talking to Dwayne in the kind of open forum about how they were going to make the details of these sort of welded connections. And I think it's related a little bit to the tortured load paths and just the sort of intensity and density of all the work. And Dwayne looked at me and said, well, I'm just going to make them. And I said, well, but how? I mean, there's a lot of stuff there that doesn't come up. You know, it's not like putting wood together. Have you ever done any of this stuff in aluminum? He's like, no, but I'm going to learn, you know. And a couple of weeks later, we were having dinner with some other friends. And we sat down at the dinner, and Jenny said, so I just have to sort of clear the air here, but Dwayne was determined to bring a sample of that detail that you were asking him about, because he made one. He was so pissed off that you thought he couldn't do it, that he made one and he was going to bring it. And I eventually saw it, and he did it incredibly. And I think that is sort of indicative of the intensity with which the work is approached. I think these sketches are a great place to stop, in a sense. And certainly these drawings as well, because there's something about the line work going to a completely different place, I think, right? That it starts with, in a way it does start with the act of like moving a pen on a piece of paper, and then it kind of goes to just how does architecture kind of trace the movement of people within it? How does it start to trace load paths? What are all of the different kind of vectoral forces that get registered in the architecture? And how does that accumulation, which is something that shows up in your work again and again, how does that start to kind of resonate within the work? And one of the great things about this, and I think I wrote this somewhere in the piece about the pendulum plane, that the work often tends to literally vibrate because there's tons of big cantilevers. And, but they also kind of effectively vibrate as well, that there's a kind of vitality to them that makes them feel almost alive. And I wonder where that comes from. Is that kind of, not just the density of the work and the kind of obvious accumulation of pieces and labor and all of that stuff, but actually getting that to kind of move to a different place, to move to a really a vitality where the projects really do seem to take on a life of their own, which I think in every case they tend to, that despite their incredibly clear systems, right? That you can go to any one of these projects and start to study them and trace individual lines, and you find that they're maniacally systematic. But at the same time, when you first encounter them, you're always kind of like, that's a lot of stuff. And is that sort of, how do you, was that moment of sort of where you kind of move past all of those systems, was that always part of the research, or is that something that kind of grew over time?
If you look at the first one, it wasn't systematic. Density fields wasn't systematic. And interestingly, it was the only one that literally did what you're saying, meaning it tried to trace a bunch of things. So we started that project. We had a model of the site, and we placed a piece in the gallery, and we started connecting to all of these things, hundreds of different things, every doorway, every space between adjacent buildings. And it was like we created a three-dimensional map of where an explosion might happen on the site, for lack of a better description. And interestingly, that's the one that didn't quite do it in the same way the other ones do, because the systematic nature of it suggested that they were moving across space. And I'm not sure we consciously said, let's not do that again. But somehow the working with the material and the idea of the system, there was just such a clear logic to how we could get more out of it that made that, it became bigger than the discussion about connecting to things or trying to make that sense of movement.
It being just the kind of the sort of vectors themselves.
Right. The sense of the movement that came out of it. Like the stair, in my mind, the stair or Ali, there was a great sense of movement, and we loved the interpretation of that, but something about trying to make it with a conscious effort to create that movement felt forced. It felt like it could more easily come out of the logic of making.
Well, there's also a kind of a funny shift in those projects. I mean, I do think that the M&A installation was a transition from much more traditionally tectonic assemblies that the earlier stuff like the project in Arcadia and some of the, and you can see it a little bit even in the student work, but that there was always a detail or a joint or a piece that kind of where those vectors had to stop and change direction and then pick up again. And in the density field, or I get the names wrong, but density fields was at the M&A, that one had corners in a way, right? And all of the other aluminum projects tended not to. Like, I think you might have introduced some of those bends at the M&A as a kind of
I think that's
late stage innovation, or no?
I think that's a good segue to the next topic. I think, that's one of those kind of small inventions that we did that then completely changed the way we worked. So maybe we could actually
let us get into that.
And
We're not avoiding that, but this will much better address those.
Oh, okay.
And so everybody
points.
else will also understand what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So.
So in 2007, as we're talking about, we started a series of projects. We did 4 of them that were in aluminum. And the first of them was density fields. And we thought it would be helpful to say why we kept doing these and why we continue to do them in some form. When we did density fields, each of these lines was generated from that kind of three-dimensional map of the site. And they were done using a conventional technique of for making corners. We would cut the aluminum, we would then re-weld it using this jig and grind it back down cleanly. And while it made for a pretty clean joint, there were some limitations to it. For one, it was incredibly labor intensive. And for the next project, we moved to this technique because there were, I don't know, 10 times as many corners as there was in the previous one. And just this simple act of bending completely changed our reading of the work. Suddenly the work had the ability to create this much more fluid field in a way that the other one didn't. So before, what you would get were trajectories, things that seemed to suggest a reference to things outside of the piece itself. Where in this one, it was much easier to create a fluid field in which none of the modules or elements themselves read as individual pieces. So here we are, pendulum plane, this new idea where from below the piece, I think that's the next image, from below the piece, when the piece is up in the ceiling position, what you read is really just a fluid field. And the idea was that it was just a ceiling. It was not understood at all as any sort of performative functional device at all. And we really attribute that to the fact that the fluid joints created that reading. But then from directly below, like in the image on the right, there's a much clearer understanding of each of the modules that could then fold down.
I think another thing that became important in especially this project was the idea of even having some sort of function with the piece. So if you go back, you can see that the actual piece moves and then it folds down and holds a display board. So that was the beginning of ideas of how do we actually let people interact with the piece, and how do you actually occupy the piece, and that kind of led us to this project, which was at the SCI-Arc gallery, Livewire, which is a working staircase that connects the bottom to the catwalk. And we wanted to do a piece that was about kind of being able to occupy the space in a different way. And then also a kind of a structural experiment of using 1-inch aluminum tubing to create these set of loops that programmatically connect the handrails with the treads with the wing element. Of course, when we first told Matt about using 1-inch aluminum tubing, he sort of thought we were crazy, and of course proposed a much larger members instead of using the 1-inch. And one of the things that we worked closely with our engineers and that we wanted to use the idea of layering the members rather than using larger pieces to create the structural stabilities. And then we also figure out, and which we thought really added to the aesthetic of the piece, is creating these even thinner pipes, which we call ties, to break up the larger spanned wings. So this is, functioning stair. We actually walked up and down it.
I just wanted to say one more thing about why we kept doing what we were doing. When we first got out of school, I think we both had this really, what was like an ethical obligation to ourselves. We had a feeling that we would come out, and as architects, we had to reinvent ourselves with every project. It was like, we had been grown up with a religion that said you had to do that. And the more we practiced, the more projects we made, the more we realized that we were leaving things unfinished with every single project. And over the last 10 years, we've grown to feel like it's now our ethical obligation to continue to work on the pieces and to continue to ask how we can build on the things that we've learned from the previous projects.
But at the same time, knowing that if we stop learning at some stage, we could move on and look at other things. So
right, it's like on one hand you have to keep doing what you're doing so that you can build from it. On the other hand, you have to be super conscious of the fact that work can become stagnant and comfortable if you're not continuing to ask it what else it can do,
So
or
did
to
that
find
happen yet
offshoots.
on the aluminum projects?
we think maybe.
Yeah, well, certainly, like we feel like at this scale, realize. I should, just as a disclaimer, say, if we discover that at this scale it can do more, then we're not afraid to go back to it.
Right.
At this moment, we don't know what else to do with it at this scale.
Did that happen with the wood projects? I know you haven't shown any of them, so it's not totally fair to them, but
That's a good question.
thank you.
Did it? I don't know if it had happened or if we had gotten bored with it. I almost feel like we were
So that's
continuing
not
to
the
work
same
on.
thing.
No,
Yeah,
it's,
that's different.
I almost think that we thought that we were making progress with each one, but the steps were too small.
Uh-huh.
And so that move into the aluminum was like so radically different in terms of materiality and the ambition of doing that work that it was like, holy shit, we could take a really big step here.
Was it just that you wanted to buy more tools, or was it more?
Well, I want to do
I
that
know
regardless
that,
of what we're doing.
but-
No. It was just, I think if we, at that time, if we tried to track the trajectory forward, if we tried to project it forward, we're imagining where we would be in 10, 20 years, and it wasn't really far enough.
But I also feel like at some point when we get too comfortable at doing something, we stop doing it. And I think we were really comfortable with the wood, and so we had to do something we had no idea how to do. And I think maybe that's also, in terms of the aluminum, we've done 4 of them. And at some point when we did this piece, this was a piece that was, it was over almost 2.5 stories tall, and it launched at Staples Center across LA Live, across from Staples Center, and it became at a point, unless we can get this kind of funding again, it was at a scale where it's really hard to keep doing the aluminum work and expand on the scale. But then we also discover in working in such a kind of a popular culture area, which is, we've always been in so small galleries rather than a place where there's non-architects looking at the work. And we realized which was kind of a nice addition to the experience, to have, sports fans and other people engage the work. So, I think that then it definitely allows us to think forward, like if we want to engage a larger audience, how do we switch materials? How do we, move on?
Do you think that I hadn't thought about the audience question before, but I think that's an interesting one, that it would be somehow related to materials or to the assembly techniques, and as much as to like the kind of containment of the objects, right? So like whether you're building in like a backyard where really nobody's going to see it, or in a small gallery where it's going to, that somehow to appeal to 20,000 people coming out of the Staples Center requires a different construction technique, as well as, because I remember going to see that piece, and I for whatever reason hadn't seen a whole lot of the kind of ramp up to it. I knew that you guys were doing it, but I didn't, I went and saw it like just cold. I just stopped there on the way to school one day and went, and I didn't even know that it was going to make the face at me, and so I thought I was going to see, just like a bigger, badder, more kind of intense aluminum construct, which is exactly what it was. And then you kind of turn around the corner and Muhammad Ali is staring you in the face. What the fuck? I mean, the feeling that your work had always produced in me, which was the first time you see it, like, my God, like so much effort has been expended on this thing to do something that in most cases was kind of simple. Right? I mean, there's this incredible expenditure of effort. Doing it the hard way could be the kind of mantra for a lot of that work. And as soon as the kind of image just snapped into place, and you get into this, there's this weird tension between you and the collaborating artist. And I noticed it in the film that you showed of the piece as well, that you didn't focus on the object. You focused a lot on the process and a lot on the end on Kailish's end product. But the specificity of how that thing is organized, which is really careful, right? The way that the shift along the axis, the way that all of the systems kind of talk to each other across that axis. There's an incredible game of symmetry making and breaking that goes on in that piece, and all of the pieces kind of correspond to it. So what initially looks like a sort of almost haphazard, exuberant pile of aluminum turns out to be maniacally systematic. And then what looks like a kind of cloud of balloons turns out to be a portrait. So there was a similarity between the two. But I think that I find it interesting that you didn't foreground that part and rather chose to foreground the process of putting it together, which...
Yeah. Can I answer that?
Yeah.
That's just because it was the footage we had. It's
really?
interesting that you noticed that. We don't have footage of us actually building it, which we would much rather show that than the assembly, but it was what we had. But you do bring up something that was the great challenge of this piece, which is we noticed very early on in doing this kind of work, even with the stair, that as a formal language, this stuff doesn't want to be broken down. You know, it wants to read as fluid, continuous pieces, and the idea of dividing it doesn't work very well. So the way that this one does break down in order to mask that, the modular existence of the pieces, is that they kind of nest into one another, and they only go, you know, you can only get them together by carefully wiggling them past some other piece.
Yeah.
So that was one of the great challenges, and it remains one of the problems with our work is once you build them, they're very difficult to get somewhere else because they...
But then, I mean, it does raise this question of audience that Jenny brought into the conversation, which is, you know, how, I mean, is the audience shifting from a more kind of expert connoisseur, somebody who's going to come in and take the time to read all of those systems, or is it, or not, or how do you kind of balance those two opposing things? Because I think anybody at the Staples, you know, anybody that's going there could appreciate the incredible amount of labor that went into this thing. It's not so foreign as to seem like it fell from space. It seems like, you know, a kind of incredibly intense welder with too much, you know, was getting paid by how much tubing he could actually use.
Right. I mean, I sort of think it's not shifting, more it's expanding, where, you know, before, what's nice about the piece is it kind of, you can get it in many different ways. Someone, you know, as simply, it's like there's the face to get, you know, you kind of get it. If you're a sports fan, you see the face, you're happy. And then there's people that came up to us and they just don't care about the face. They care about the details. They care about the floating bags. And so, I mean, I think it's nice that it can read in different ways and, you know, and not be just so singular.
Well, I think that kind of, that split personality within the work is, it's part of the way that the two of you operate and the way that the two of you sort of present yourselves as well. You know, the other little story that I was thinking was about comparing your fingernails, right? I mean, inevitably you see these two, and Dwayne's fingers will look like they've just been, like, you know, soaked in motor oil for the past 2 weeks. And Jenny will inevitably, I mean, look, she will have just come from some incredibly intense manicure. And so on one hand, there is this aggressive, stylized stuff, and then on the other, you know, it's not to say that Jenny is, like, not concerned with putting the pieces together. She's always out there. I mean, Dwayne does not appear to be particularly concerned with his cuticles, but that split, right? The sort of attentive stylishness and the kind of garage band craft, you know, the sort of DIY. There are very few practices that attempt to play both sides of that. And there are even fewer that pull it off. And maybe how does that feed into the process? And maybe that gets us to some of these transitions. But like that kind of dualism in the two of you, as well as in the work, I think is interesting.
Maybe we can answer that after we go through this. I sort of feel like this is where a point in our office where that dualism and that there is a little bit of a schizophrenia going on in the office, especially the fact that, you know, at this point in time, while simultaneously we're working on the smaller work, you know, we keep joking that our office only have the XS and then the XL. Like, we're doing really large projects in Asia, mainly in Taipei. But before we look at the Taipei work, you know, just expanding on the scale of doing larger work. Most of you know this project. It's still outside.
Let me respond just
Okay.
with what probably is probably too personal of an answer to a question that wasn't really a personal question. I think we really try not to be conscious of the difference because you both want to so desperately. I desperately want to do what she does so well, and she wants to do what I do well. And to say that's your thing and that's my thing, it's destructive. So I think we try to collectively move forward with all of them with a similar sensibility, knowing that you can't exactly do that.
Yeah, but then when it turns into one thing, the danger is that it gets, the tension starts to fall out of the work. You know, when you start showing up with manicures.
Yeah, you should worry.
I think that
you
we
should
should all
worry.
worry.
Yeah. I'll have to. I'll have to think about that one. But I promise not to get any manicures. So transition into bigger work, or different kinds of work. We've always said that we like to operate with a common set of ideas that are going on within the office, but that there are strands that happen, there are offshoots from any given project. And at the end of every project, we look and say, there are a couple of things that we would like to pursue at some later point. And as Jenny said, with the aluminum work, we had kind of reached an end for realizing that to do one much bigger than that requires astronomical budgets, and we could no longer do them ourselves. And so we turned to ways that we could work with ideas of line and the shaping of space in similar ways, but in a way that used the material more and the natural behavior of the material in order to create that space. So with the grad pavilion, the one we'll talk the least about, it was really trying to look to a material that had a behavior under tension with gravitational forces acting on them that would start to create those natural curvatures through space and do it in a big way across a large field.
So then back to the Asian projects. So about 4 years ago, we started doing a lot of proposals for work in Asia, and mostly they were proposals. Most of them, especially in Taipei, it's a relatively conservative architectural scene. I mean, the building you see behind our piece is sort of the typical thing there. And so, you know, most of the time we would talk to a developer and they said, okay, well, we can give you a chance, but, you know, can you do everything you want to do within 5 feet of depth, let's say. And so, you know, it's always like they don't want to change their floor plans. They don't want to, you know, change all the things that they've done before, but they just want you to create a skin. This is our first project. It's called Anemone. It's a first project we actually didn't build ourselves because we couldn't, you know, spend the time out there. But there was about 60,000 rubber tubing, and it worked as both a wall and a ceiling, and then back down to kind of a bed, sort of horizontal surface which you can lie on. So we have 5 feet of depth, and then, but then the other requirements is always, now most of them have been residential towers. And so you have the kind of very repetitive, regular balcony system that then how do we create any sort of variation within that? So.
And we've done, I don't know, 5 or 6 of these now. And looking back on the earlier ones that we were doing, it was, you know, they were going on at the same time. This one was going on, I think, at the same time Pendulum Plane was going on. And we were really asking ourselves what the relevance of that smaller scale work might have on the bigger work. And I think, admittedly, looking back on it now, it hadn't found a translation that was yet appropriate to the scale of the work. I think we look at it and there are some graphic qualities that we like. Some of the connections are right in terms of trying to get from the ground upward. But there was an applique quality to it that kept it from reading as spatial, that kept it from having much of an impact on any of the individual units. The one thing it did accomplish was the breakdown of repetitive reading of each of the apartments. But we have since then been in search of ways of scaling it or transforming it into something that might have a deeper impact on the building.
And I think
literally and figuratively.
I think especially this image, this proposal, we just found the fundamental problem of the line not being able to do all the work that we wanted to do. And it's not about just purely line as in a single piece of material, but it's really about a play of material, let's say a surface and a line. So this is a proposal we did last year. It's a play of both now surfaces and lines to reinforce the kind of the flows that we were trying to create.
And then finally to one of the most recent projects. This is the one that will be built, knock on wood. It's a 16-story tower, residential units, 2 units per floor. Essentially the same requirements as the previous projects, although a different developer, different site. Here you have roughly 5-6 feet to work with, and 2 units per floor, with balconies more or less in the same place. In this case, we've come to, we call the project low-res, high-rise, because it's really taking those ideas, that idea of line, and the first sketches were really identical to some of the earlier projects where you see the lines moving up the surface. But in this case, those lines have been broken down into a low-resolution solution so that you start to have differentiated impact on each one of the floors as you move up. And you still get that reading, albeit low-res, of the flows of lines.
And then ever since we did more work in Asia, somehow it had given us some background in doing larger projects. So we were then approached by clients in the States to do bigger projects as well. And so we call this as our high-res, low-rise. And this is a building in Hollywood for the company IAC. And it is a existing 8-story building that they wanted us to actually skin the entire exterior without really changing the interior, which we seem to become an expert in.
But here you see the big transition going from line into surface. And we had asked for a long time, probably starting with the live wire project, how this how you might create enclosure, for example, with all of the line work. And I think this is the first step into that, where you're still getting a sense of the line as the structure that exists behind it, and in fact some that becomes only line at the base. I think there's another image, becoming a canopy for the restaurant on the lower right.
Unfortunately, this project went on hold.
So this is super hot off the presses. This was rendered this morning. This is for a boutique hotel downtown, a shortlist competition, in which we're interested in taking that idea of the curtain further. And the great thing about this project is for so long with those bigger projects, we've really been interested in ways of going back to that idea that you see in the earlier projects where we're really starting to shape interior space. This is the first time we have the opportunity to actually create those kind of spaces or extensions of that geometry into the lobby itself. And before we go to Todd, we're going to show one more video.
space designed by two of the faculty members, Dwayne Oyler and his partner Jenny Wu, for this graduation ceremony. And the usual nature, believe it or not, in architectural institutions that support their own faculty and that are committed to the reality of its ideas, which is this thing we're occupying today.
So you know, once again, the video primarily, you know, these kind of gratuitous pornographic close-ups of tools and construction, right? And you know, it does raise a really interesting, I don't know if dilemma. Dilemma is probably too challenge, let's say, in developing the practices. That at a certain point, to do these larger projects, you have to stop doing that, right? Yep. And given that it has been so much...
You have to stop doing them for the large projects.
Yeah.
You don't have to stop doing them, necessarily.
You have to... You aren't going to make that.
Yeah.
I know you're not going to stop. I've seen your tool room. I have no worries of that. But there is, you know, I mean, given that so much of the work is associated with the fact that the two of you did it, like that, and it's very much foregrounded in the work, and I think it differentiates you quite dramatically from a lot of architects of our generation, insofar as that you showed only a couple renderings, and only renderings for, you know, like kind of the later Taipei work, but all the earlier stuff, no renderings, right? And instead, there's this kind of really attentive tectonic articulation, which is something that you'll see in a lot of architecture. You know, there are a number of fellow travelers who are less concerned with problems of tectonics. There is, you know, Greg Lynn's recent writings about that the contemporary moment is where we can finally kind of free ourselves from traditional piece-to-piece tectonics and start using composites and glues and develop a completely different thing. The renderings kind of give way to diagrams in a sense, or process drawings, and you know, just a kind of general celebration of the alleged freedoms afforded the discipline by digital technologies, virtual environments, all of that stuff. There seems to be a resistance to that as well, and a kind of and a much more considered attentiveness to actual craft. So in all of those, there seems to be I don't want to call it resistance, I don't want to call it nostalgia, I don't want to call it conventionality, but all of those words in weird ways apply. And to end with Tom at SCI-Arc and thinking about the SCI-Arc of the mid-'70s and the SCI-Arc of today, and the old school attempt to like do it yourself, make it yourself. There's a strange kind of maintenance of a lot of the heroics of construction, and at the same time an obvious not just ambition but also ability to kind of move beyond that. And I wonder if you just talk a little bit about to me, the tension is very obvious. I mean, when I look at you, when I look at the work and I talk to you guys, and I kind of see how you're trying to maintain a certain level of that kind of hands-on DIY craftsmanship in these projects, where you're not going to be able to maintain that, I'm guessing. Right. How do you feel about that? I guess would be the.
Well, we know we can't maintain it. When we say we want to continue doing it, I'll pretend that I don't love physically doing it. We just think that it's added something, and it'll keep the work evolving if we do it on some level. But we recognize that 99% of the time we can't continue it.
But I think I sort of think that this is where, you know, especially for instance, this earlier this project, you know, when we got an actual kind of approached a contractor to get a bid for the job, And they looked at it, they're like, are you kidding me? And then we actually went through, we spent an hour, we like went through all of our work. We showed them exactly how we would build it and how we think they should build it. And at the end, you know, they actually gave us, we thought, a fairly reasonable bid. I mean, it was $15 million or something, but, you know, for this kind of work. But I think that for us, it's not necessary, at least for me, it's not necessarily just about, you know, the craft of making this thing, but just really understanding the material and how we can make this thing so that we could do bigger work like this.
Do you see any opportunities in letting go in that sense? You know, I mean, part of the theme of a lot of the stuff that you talked about today was that each move into a new territory opened up possibilities for the work to take advantage of, right? Like the impossibility of doing all the welds for the pendulum plane brought you to the Gardner bender and, you know, opened up a different kind of language for the work, and it had expressive repercussions. Right. And maybe it's too soon to tell, but I wonder, you know, as the projects leave your shop and get turned over to the hands of GCs and CMs, do you see some things out there that you would like to take advantage of that
as far
require
as the
contractors
technology
rather
that they
than,
might have?
Yeah, I mean, I look at it that it'd be easy to come away from this lecture and leave with a sort of old-fashioned attitude that the contractor is somehow a constraint. And I wonder if you guys see opportunities there.
No,
we've
dreamt of a CNC bender from the moment we made that first bend. So, you know, we're not by any stretch of the imagination using the most sophisticated technology we could to create these. We were simply using what we could. So, no, by all means, we're completely open to that. And for that language, something like CNC bender, I don't know if you've ever seen these things, but they're incredible. You know, it's one tube going in and it makes the first bend, it rotates it.
Let's see, look at them go.
And pretty soon you've got...
You're incorrigible.
I do wanted to say something though, about the craft issue. I never know how to respond to the craft thing entirely, but a couple of things. One, if you look at the work, the stair, for example, was the first project where this came up. There are joints that we grind out and they look clean and they don't exist, and there are joints we celebrate, welds. And Livewire was the first one where we left a weld. You could actually see the weld.
But listen, what there never is, there are never zip ties. There's never duct tape. There are never
there are zip ties in the
crutches.
pavilion. Yeah.
There are never obvious crutches. I
Right,
mean,
right.
the thing about the work is that when you come to one of those crutch moments, you actually figure out the detail and solve it.
Right.
Whereas in many cases, those crutch moments are like, well, we're going to work that one out next time around.
Right.
And I think that again, I mean, this sort of aggressive commitment to actually solving the tectonics, what you call the sort of ethical commitment to actually sort that out. I mean, I think it's absolutely admirable. But I mean, it takes up so much of your time. I guess,
no, it's a good point. Related to that, maybe not, is we stopped doing competitions with the exception of pendulum plane a long time ago, and it had to do with us realizing that we could never, as soon as we started building the things, we looked back on the renderings and representations we were doing of the pieces that could be put out there for the sake of a competition, not the more abstract drawings, but those that you could hand to a jury. And they never captured what the work did itself. And in our minds, it always had to do with the material quality and that detailing and where we chose to create no seam versus seam. Yeah. And it still is kind of why we don't do competitions.
Having been there for the pendulum plane competition and seeing the model won it for you. The model that actually was counterbalanced and it all worked, and people were like, well, that's completely crazy. And that's what won it. But, you know, so again, I mean, it really is a kind of huge part of it. But it also helped you in a lot of ways in the earlier work, and this is the last point I want to make before we want to get a couple of, we're totally late already, probably. But in each of the facade projects, it was interesting the way that you presented them, Jenny. Like, this is what we had to work with. We had to obey these rules, and if only we could kind of have more of a spatial impact within the project. And so in each one of those, and for a lot of reasons you have to do this, but you were kind of behaving in most of the earlier projects, your control over the assembly and fabrication of the pieces allowed you to kind of push them way beyond what was expected, way beyond what the budgets normally would support, all of that other stuff. And even, the Guggenheim model, like the Guggenheim calls you up, asks for a drawing, and you send them the most insane model instead. And I wonder, how do you keep that misbehaving component in there? Because I have to admit that the facade projects, to me, they seem slightly timid given the incredible intensity of the earlier studies. And so how do you bring that intensity to something that you can't cheat by
By just putting
paying
your
for all
time
the
in.
labor yourself?
I still think we're still figuring that out. Of course, like with most of the earlier project, we ourselves were kind of the client, so we didn't have to answer to that. We're in the bigger work, not only we have a client, we have a real budget. And so but I think we're always coming away with sort of trying to, me, like feng shui is like my biggest crux, like how do we deal with all these issues that we cannot have, in a residence. So, I mean, we're learning. That's something we're trying to definitely misbehave more. Mm-hmm. But it's also, we have to at some point get something built so that we can build more there. So.
And there are different tracks you can take. We are not expecting to build Disney Concert Hall on our first crack at it.
Right.
Like we're trying to define what's really important to us, get those built, but without having to compromise on those issues. Mm-hmm. And we believe that down the road that will grow into, clients allowing us to misbehave much more.
Questions?
Anyone? Well, we're right at 2:00, so last call. Okay, well, thanks
Thank you.
for this, and I always have fun talking to you guys, and I really look forward to seeing more misbehaving. So you're free to go.